This is Lars. Thanks again for checking out my podcast. Enjoy your day and the show, and let's make America great again.
And Joe Thomas is my name, and I am here sitting in for your friend and mine, Lars Larson, tonight from Charlottesville, Virginia. You remember Charlottesville, Virginia?
They came at each other with
the land where Donald Trump once told us.
They came at each other with clubs, and it was vicious, and it was horrible, and it was a horrible thing to watch. But there is another side. There was a group on this side, you can call them the left, or you've just called them the left, that came violently attacking the other group. So you can say what you want, but that's the way it is. I think there's blame on both sides. You look at both sides. I think there's blame on both sides.
So here's my question to start it off. And you all have your hometowns. And there was so much that was untold about Charlottesville in our summer of discontent in 2017. What stories made national headlines from your hometown that are, I wouldn't even say mistold, undertold? I mean, some fairly seminal things about Charlottesville in 2017. David Duke was the keynote speaker at the rally in the park. I think that's a pretty important thing to leave out. There are several others, but you have hometowns as well. I just spent 4 days in Memphis at Freedom Fest with Mark and Joanne Skousen. And Memphis, certainly a historically famous city, Beale Street, the blues, rock and roll, Elvis. And it is sad. Every third building I passed was empty and boarded up, and I mean major high-rise buildings. And it's like so many downtowns. Is Portland in the peril of going the same way? I mean, buildings that have been empty for a decade, right in the middle, right on the Mississippi waterfront. And they blame COVID, even though many of these buildings had been empty for 10 years. I know we're on the mighty 990 KWAM, Todd Starnes' great station there in Memphis. What parts of the Memphis story are undertold or not told? And how much is what's gone on in any of these downtown areas warning klaxon to all of the folks who hold elected office and partake in what I call Munchausen's by government syndrome, where the government makes you sick only to insist they're the only ones who can make you well again. So we've got a lot to get into this evening, and of course you join in at 866-HEY-LARS. One of my favorite expressions Lars came up with, talk journalism. Now, just so you know, a little hand sniffing here, I don't come from a journalism background the way Lars does. I was a rock and roll DJ, and I just hung around with a lot of journalists. So when I got into the spoken word format, that's when I found myself following the rabbit holes that journalists had taught me to follow. Always ask the next question. It's not, and if they get offended, well, they weren't going to be your buddy anyway. You can also Instagram and Facebook at The Lars Larson Show, Twitter at Lars Larson Show. Follow the podcast as well. And make sure you give a call, Mackenzie, back in the studio, 866-439-5277. I have to chuckle because listeners of our station in Charlottesville are calling the studio line there. No. Call Lars's show, and we'll get you on the air at 866-439-5277. 1-866-HEY-LARS. We have a Twitter poll. Should America put sanctions on China? And this is enormously controversial because if you want to split up a room full of what ostensibly would be considered conservatives, talk about trade policy. And this is one of the things that always drove people crazy about Donald Trump. Oh, but Joe, conservatives are supposed to believe in free trade. And I always would say, well, how is it free if one country is using slave labor in some cases and certainly not enriching the God-given rights of their citizens in any event, never mind the ones they don't view as equally as human as their regular citizens? So how is that free trade? Well, Joe, we get inexpensive widgets. As well, okay, we get inexpensive widgets. How many Americans would we have to employ to get inexpensive widgets? Or how expensive would a widget have to become if we were going to pay a union wage to manufacture them? Ron Paul once said during a presidential debate, and I'm paraphrasing here, that a $1,000 iPad doesn't help the American economy either. This was when it was all the rage. All the cool kids were saying that Apple should be forced to bring their manufacturing back to the United States. And Ron Paul said, well, his point being, look at our labor policy before you do that. How does it pencil out for a business to make a tablet computer or a bottle opener or anything? How many of them are they going to have to make? And post-COVID, we are seeing that in the restaurant industry. Across the country, here in my home state of Virginia, we're mandating higher wages, and the restaurants doing as they did in Venezuela when Hugo Chavez mandated higher wages. They raised the cost of everything. Joe Biden has said several times that he's in favor of some price controls. Well, that's what Chavez did next, and they had food riots. And Venezuela, one of the most resource-rich countries in the Western Hemisphere, not named the United States of America, is destitute. Because of price controls, because of wage and price controls that sound good when you say them until all the jobs go away, when people just shutter the doors to their stores and say, I'm not doing this anymore. It costs me too much to make something. And when you listen to progressives, and they seem to think that people start jobs just to start a job, it's a head scratcher there. Also, we're going to get into the nonsense. They're back again with the hottest days ever in the history of the planet. I was talking to Steve Malloy from Junk Science just the other day, and he says this is just not even true in the least little bit. The press is having fun with fundraising. Now it begins. Now it's how can we demean you by pointing to how little your fundraising total is. Iran has brought back its morality police. The Inspector General just told us that of the $888 billion given away in unemployment benefits during COVID, nearly $200 billion of it, most likely fraud, as if people like Lars hadn't warned you about that the moment it started happening. Congresswoman Jayapal said Israel is a racist state. And please go vote in that Twitter poll about China. It's brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens, Conservative Values, AMAC.us, 888-262-2006. It is Joe Thomas from Lars's great station in the second greatest city in the history of mankind, Charlottesville, Virginia. We're not living up to it right now, but based on the work product of Charlottesville and Galilee, more people live in freedom on the face of the earth than ever have before. I want to go to Greg first at 1-866. Hey, Lars. How you doing, Greg? You're on the show. What's on your mind before we get to Congressman Good?
Well, what a great surprise. Two quick things. One is I did a job in D.C. right after the Charlottesville incident with the crazy people down there, and which to me was instigated by a lot of the left-leaning city councilors. But that being said, you know, this person said, oh, I'm so sorry. I went in this coffee house and right next to the job site in D.C., and this person came and said, well, I'm so sorry you have to deal with all the racism and horrible things in Charlottesville. I said, look, it's not like that down there. These were outsiders. Mm-hmm. It just so happened that people came to a town that didn't belong there and created havoc on both sides. It was not people who live in Charlottesville. The other thing I want to say very quickly, if you have time, and that is I think we're going to be all right as the United States if we'll just grow up and quit fussing at each other. One of the global issues is demographics. Russia's people are declining. China's people are declining. Europe's people are declining. And our Navy can no longer protect commerce. And so things are happening in the world that are really, really dangerous. But if we would just get smart and learn to get along and quit going and having all these radical leftist social arguments and just get busy doing work and figuring out how to get along and do things, I think we'll be all right, because Europe's going to be troublesome, Russia's going to be trouble, and China, because just the fact that their population is aging faster than they can reproduce.
That's Greg, from your lips to God's ears. I appreciate it, my friend. You have a good evening, sir. Joining us now from the House Freedom Caucus to talk a little bit about the National Defense Authorization Act tweaks that went in at the end of last week. He is Congressman Bob Good from the Commonwealth of Virginia. Bob, good to hear from you. How are you doing, sir?
Good evening, Joe. Great to be with you at a rare evening hour. Thanks for having me.
For those who wanted to know if Joe Thomas in the morning was still Joe Thomas in the evening, there is your answer. So a lot is being missaid, and you've already faced controversy over your stand on some of the national defense authorization bills. And I feel like they think, they being the authoritarians in Washington and other places, don't think we can have a learned conversation with nuance, that either you're for all the defense or you're against all the defense. And it's not really as easy as a binary 1 or 0, is it, Bob?
It is not. And, all this hand-wringing and this reaction emotionally that, Republicans passed with a Republican majority a Republican NDAA that reverses the extremism of the Democrat Party with full control the last 2 years. All that the Republicans did was to implement Republican priorities, or really to reverse the climate, environmental extremism, the transgender LGBTQ policies, the abortion, the unlawful abortion rule that the Biden administration implemented last year after the Dobbs decision, and a focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and training our military members in CRT ideology, that sort of thing. We've essentially reversed that and went back with a focus, as it should be, on force readiness, lethality, effectiveness, to try to reverse the downward recruiting trends in our military. And the Democrats are acting like we created this out of whole cloth, and all we're doing is returning to the policies from just a few years ago.
And talk about the parts of this bill, the tweaking of the NDAA that fights back against the outside influences and censorship in America's media, Bob.
Well, yeah, what you had was, again, hundreds of amendments, literally trying to make this bill even stronger, but to eliminate the ability of to push woke ideology and harmful policy that weakens our military or targets members of the military based on, frankly, political affiliation or political ideology or political viewpoint. We saw that happening over the last couple of years under this Biden administration under Austin and Milley. But, yeah, what we're trying to do is protect service members' rights, protect Americans' rights, and inhibit the federal government's ability to use its power to censor viewpoints.
Congressman Bob Good is on with us, good.house.gov. No, it's not a cookbook. But, Bob, the most controversial part, and the press is still running around saying they're trying to ban abortion. It's a shadow ban on abortion. That's not what this, if I understand it correctly, what this does at all. This just says taxpayer money has to go through the process of going through Congress before it's used to fund abortion tourism, correct?
That's correct. Until last year, historically, for decades going back, no taxpayer dollars have been used to fund abortion. You had the Hyde Amendment, which was, really brought Republicans and Democrats, pro-life and so-called pro-choice together for decades, 40, 50 years, to say that at least taxpayer dollars shouldn't be used to fund abortion. And Democrats, including Joe Biden and many older Democrats still in office today, voted for the Hyde Amendment just even a few years ago. But all authorization bills, all appropriation bills to this point had included Hyde Amendment, which again just said taxpayer dollars can't be used to fund abortion. But last year, after the Dobbs decision, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the Biden administration just implemented a rule to say, hey, we're going to pay for travel expenses and paid time off for service members who want to get an abortion at taxpayer expense. And so all of our amendment did the Jackson Amendment, the former White House physician, Ronnie Jackson, congressman from Texas, his amendment, which was passed by all but I think 2 Republicans voted for it, became codified into law that you can't use taxpayer dollars to pay for abortion travel or abortion expenses for members of the military. Just like we also had an amendment to say that you can't use taxpayer dollars in the defense bill, in defense authorization or appropriations bill, to fund transgender surgery for members of the military. And that was a new policy implemented by the Biden administration the last couple of years. And so what we're doing is rolling back and reversing those kind of things that are frankly making our military weaker, taking the focus on what it should be, which is to be the most lethal, potent fighting and killing machine so that nobody on the planet wants to challenge us.
Bob, last one, Congressman McCall today was saying that he thinks there are going to be Democrats coming over to this once they actually read it. Do you share that in the minute we have left?
Well, it should be a Republican bill coming out of the Republican House, and it'll go into conference once the Senate passes their bill, and there will likely be some give and take to it. But frankly, Speaker McCarthy ought to say the people gave us the majority in the House. That reflects where the American people are. These are common sense reforms that focus, again, on effectiveness, readiness, making the military as strong as it can possibly be, and it's the opposite of how much the media has portrayed it. We're getting the culture issues out of the military, frankly, and we're focused on just funding the military being the strongest military in the world.
The fight over the spending still going well?
Well, I wouldn't quite say that. It's going to be battles. We're going to be continuing to focus on that this week and next week before we have scheduled time back in our district. We'll see if we get that done in time or whether or not we'll stay in D.C. into August instead of getting back to the district. But we are determined, Joe, to cut spending back to pre-COVID levels for non-defense discretionary. That's what we committed to back in January when we voted in a speaker, and we intend to hold the leadership to that.
Congressman Bob Good, Virginia's 5th Congressional District. Thank you, sir. You have a wonderful evening.
Great to be with you, Joe. Thank you.
And you join us as well. Of course, the phone number is 866-HEY-LARS. You can also vote in the Twitter poll. Should the United States be imposing sanctions on China? Janet Yellen had some things to say about that as well. You can also follow us on Facebook at The Lars Larson Show. And you also have Getter at Lars Larson, iTunes podcast there as well. And don't forget, try to, if you can, get the Lars Larson Show Challenge Coin at LarsLarson.com. My name is Joe Thomas from the great city of Charlottesville, Virginia. The slogan should say, not the one you see on CNN. Thank you for joining us and letting us be of service to you. My name is Joe Thomas, and Lars has asked me to sit in with you while he's taking a little bit of a break, and you can still join us at 866-HEY-LARS. Emails most efficiently if you just send them to Joe at WCHV.com. Then I'll get them and I'll read them on the air, and we'll get it. I'm going to jump to the Twitter poll for a second. It is a runaway. Brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens, Conservative Values. I'm a member, you're a member, we're a pepper. Go to amac.us or call them at 888-262-2006. AMAC is better for you, better for Americans. But I was just looking at the results so far of the Lars Larson Show Twitter poll. 92% of the respondents say America should sanction China over fentanyl trafficking. 7.9% say no. And the fentanyl crisis is borderless. And I love listening to folks say, well, it's not, it's a part of the fentanyl, Joe. And these are the same folks who will say that if you buy some part of a firearm because you want to repair a gun, oh, you're building a ghost gun, aren't you? But they'll defend the Chi-Coms over fentanyl trafficking. And I'll be the first one to tell you, any sort of addiction, and I have mine, we all have our vices. And I truly believe that you fight vice by promoting virtue. So you want less sloth, promote more diligence, tell more stories about people who are diligent. Unfortunately, our vices dominate our headlines way more so than the instances where people are virtuous. And we are all broken, failed, frail people who fall prey to various things. We have a friend who lost his son to fentanyl because he had gotten hooked on opioid painkillers. And he's very clear about it. He says, I understand my son got in trouble with a legal drug and then said, I need to find a way to find the illegal drug. And you can draw a medical care. We've talked about this with some of the folks at the Pacific Legal Foundation and some of the great medical care experts, Dean Clancy at the Americans for Prosperity. And one of the problems ever since we started to nationalize our health care is that we are manifesting everything that Lars told you about, that I told you about on my local program. We're doing less and less treatment and more and more management. Remember the famous quote from Paul Krugman on ABC This Week with George Snuffleupagus? And Paul Krugman was questioned, and George wasn't the host this week. George would never have asked this. But they were talking about death panels. This was right after Sarah Palin called Obamacare out for having death panels. And he's like, wow, Republicans, they say, we have death panels and they don't save any money. And then the host said, so death panels would save money? And Krugman, so consumed in his brilliance, right, socialist economist, said, well, of course, you have a panel that determines what treatment, what kind of expensive treatment somebody's going to be allowed to get. And it was that just moment of brilliant truthiness that snuck out from Paul Krugman right there on national television. I keep it as a clip just because I need to remind myself that you squeeze them long enough, like the gift that keeps on giving our once and former governor, Terry McAuliffe, when he was tweaked by Glenn Youngkin in a debate to finally admit, no, parents shouldn't have anything to do with the way their kids are educated. Oh, thank you for letting us look behind the curtain, Terry and Paul. But that's where we have devolved to in our health care. We give opioids rather than trying to fix the pain. We give the opioids too frequently, too prominently in many cases, especially in the poor communities where you see medical care becomes more about pain management than pain eradication. And these are injuries that we would treat orthopedically prior to the nationalization, softcore nationalization of our health care. So there are, again, just like the National Defense Authorization Act, there isn't just a 1 and a 0, and either you're on the side of the ones or you're on the side of the zeros. You have to be able to see the whole field because there's so much more going on. And unfortunately, we wind up in situations. But I agree. So, China needs to be held accountable for all of this stuff getting into the country. But we need to do as much as we can. And maybe the sanctions we put on China can fund programs that help people fight the opioid addictions that grip them and drag them towards fentanyl. So vote online. The Twitter poll is at Lars Larson Show. You can go on there and jump in on that. This was an interesting exchange earlier today on The View. Now, I don't know if you saw this, and we're going to get into this with one of the particulars, but Joe Manchin and John Huntsman were the keynotes in an organization called No Labels, and The View melted down over this organization? Do we
in context? This is not a normal thing. This is not Bill Clinton versus George Herbert Walker Bush with Ross Perot playing spoiler. No, this is Donald Trump. He is a threat to national security. He has threatened our democracy. He caused an insurrection. He's weaponized government against his enemies. And so if you, John Huntsman or Joe Lieberman, I love you, Joe Lieberman, but you've got to stop this, Joe. Joe, this is insane, and you cannot do anything that could possibly help Donald Trump become president.
So the View melted down over the idea of the No Labels campaign. And when we talk to former Governor McCrory of North Carolina in just a little while, Pat McCrory is part of the No Labels group. My concern is that generally when they talk about this kind of compromise, we're the ones who have to slide left. We have to go 3 steps to the left. They might go 1 step to the right and then say, there, we've met in a middle. A self-defining middle that isn't really the middle at all. People ask me about labels frequently, and I have a Gadsden flag, beautiful, giant, framed Gadsden flag in my office here in Charlottesville, and it was given to me from a congressman who served in Congress years and years ago who was a Democrat. Yes, a Democrat with a Gadsden flag hanging in his office. Because, you know, it's almost like an English soccer league. Well, you root for Liverpool. I root for Manchester United, so we better brawl. But we have to look at what we're talking about, and we'll get into that. 866-HEY-LARS or emails to Joe at WCHV.com. Joe Thomas in for Lars Larson tonight. Joe Thomas filling in for Lars this evening and this week, and thank you for letting us do this together. 866-HEY-LARS. So do you ever grow weary when you maybe you're at a barbecue, maybe you're just over visiting, and you have one of those conversations that feels like you're being cross-examined by a Commonwealth's attorney? That's what we call DAs here in Charlottesville, Virginia. But you're under cross-examination. They're always there. Aha! I've caught you. And it's so wearisome. You just want to have a conversation. And you say, hey, can't we agree to disagree? Whatever happened to that expression? Because we have developed a place where we have attached such value, especially and unfortunately coming from the left, on what is coming from government. I was speaking about this. July 4th is a pretty big deal around here in Thomas Jefferson's hometown, as you can imagine. And I was asked to make a couple of addresses, and I was speaking about something that I've observed, and I wonder if you have as well, that the political left is pushing for freedom, as is the political right. Conservatives want freedom for things, freedom for achievement, freedom for education, freedom for advancement, freedom for accomplishment. Where the progressives, they want freedom as well. They want you to be free from things. They want you to be free from need. They want you to be free from want, scarcity. And honestly, I could have a conversation with somebody if they just wanted that. And we could go through chapter and verse of all the instances where that laudable goal, I don't want people to be poor. Every time I go to CPAC, I flatten my forehead. Every year, CPAC holds their straw poll, and every year poverty is the lowest scoring agenda item. And every year, the poor communities march into the polling places or have their ballots harvested by Mark Zuckerbucks and vote in the leftist who says, I'm going to keep you free from want, which is a compelling siren song, isn't it? Have you ever been hungry? Have you ever not known if you could get to your place of employment to get your paycheck? Jefferson, as I mentioned, kind of a big deal around here to some, once said in his famous legal filing, the Declaration of Independence, where he understood that the human inclination was to suffer the ills. All experience has shown, he wrote, that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing to the forms to which they've become accustomed. So when you say, I want to tweak the National Defense Authorization Act to get rid of these unconstitutional, amoral things, you're like, but you can't, not the Pentagon. Sure you can. Sure you can discuss that. Sure, you can discuss whether the Department of Education should even exist or the Federal Communications Commission. It's like saying the science is settled. One of the great oxymorons of the 21st century. The science is settled. And so when these folks do the no labels bit, immediately people say, oh, it's just Joe Manchin's political action committee. That Joe Manchin's going to use this to become Mr. Centrist. And he'll beat Joe Biden. See, Ms. Navarro on The View, I would caution her the no labels third party might actually help Robert F. Kennedy Jr. win the Democratic Party nomination by getting people to opt out. But the attitude is, to me, bothersome, that you can't be trusted with a voracious choice of candidates. You should be given something simple, something easy to digest, right? Doesn't it bother you when people act like you can't handle the choice of maybe 3 candidates, maybe 4? When Thomas Jefferson started the Democratic-Republican Party, everyone just, voted for the party that George Washington was in, because it was George Washington. But he saw a lot of things that were troubling. John Adams was getting un-American activities declared, things that the Revolutionary War fighters had done. So raising your hand and saying, hey, I don't think that's right, even if it's a conservative thing, or technically what you would call a conservative thing, like we were talking earlier about tariffs on international trade, the sanctions in our Twitter poll tonight. I don't have a problem with sanctions. I don't have a problem with tariffs. That might be controversial to you. You may say, no, we believe in free markets. Well, I would believe in a global government if that global government was based on the Bill of Rights, but it's not. Klaus Schwab is not out there saying we hold these truths to be self-evident. If the Bill of Rights marched across the world and every country adopted the Bill of Rights as their governing structure, I'd be okay with that. But when Iran is reinstituting their morality police, and after going quiet for a little while after a woman died in police custody, and Congresswoman Jayapal is calling Israel a racist state because, when all else fails, call somebody a racist. Gary is on the line. Do we have time for him, Kenzie? Let's see if we can get Gary in here real quick before we go to the top of the hour. Gary, you're on the Lars Larson Show.
Yes. How you doing today? I've got a question about the border. And, I hear all this stuff that we're letting everybody in and, our country is at risk. What is wrong with us having a militia, and going down there and saying, like a state militia, and said, you're not coming across this portion of the of the border. And if every state did that along the border, we'd stop them, just flat out.
Well, you saw how Mexico reacted to the temporary border barrier that Texas put up. I've got to run to the break here at the top of the hour. Former Governor McCrory, part of this No Labels group, coming up after the news. It is Joe Thomas sitting in for Lars this Monday evening at 866-HEY-LARS. That's the phone number. And you can email me, joe@wchv.com. That's the flagship station here in Charlottesville. It carries Lars's show, and I program it. And I chose Lars years and years and years ago, and it's been a great partnership ever since. And I appreciate him giving us a chance to sit down with you. And honestly, somebody once asked me, they said, I was at a talk radio conference, and they said, who's your target audience? And I looked at them dispassionately, and I said, everybody? And they said, no, Joe. I mean, you must have a target audience, 25 to 34-year-old left-handed gingers. And no, I said, I get up in the morning, and when I crack open the microphone, I hope everybody is listening, because that's how I grew up. I grew up in a big city, biggest one. Grew up in New York City in the 70s. And if you ever saw the movie The Joker, that's kind of what it looked like. And so, we were able to get things, done, but leave people alone. And independence is a very important thing. Joining us now from the No Labels campaign, just wrapping up their big town hall that has got people on The View freaked out that you're just there trying to get Donald Trump elected. He is Pat McCrory, former governor of North Carolina. Pat, how are you doing this evening? Thank you for joining me on the Lars Larson Show. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Never mind. So we will move forward from there and see if we can't square this up here. But the No Labels campaign got launched out and is now causing controversy because they say, and trust me, I understand what it means when people say, oh, so-and-so is just doing this to run for election. I live in a state that is gripped in the teeth of, you name it. Glenn Youngkin has salad for dinner, and he's only doing that just to get elected president. So we'll come back, and hopefully we'll find Pat McCrory, and he was going to join us and talk a little bit about this, because my concern about this No Labels campaign is it's a compromise of compromising, where you take 3 steps over here towards the left, and it's under the banner of the government is the answer. If the government is the answer, we're having deep problems, because the question is not a good one. If government is the answer, when you listen to people say the government is the answer to our problems, these are the ones who tell us that cities like Memphis, where I spent the better part of last week, need to be revitalized by the government. The city hall in Memphis is being rebuilt with tax dollars. And other buildings are being rebuilt with tax dollars, and new facades put on them, and off-ramps and exit ramps and public works. It's like the 30s all over again. Hey, at least this time the shovel-ready jobs are getting to the shovels, as opposed to the last time we did shovel-ready jobs. But what they never stop and say is, where did the vitality go? If you need federal or state funding to revitalize your downtown area, well, who drove the vitality out of it in the first place? We have places that have former sweatshirt manufacturers. Memphis itself, International Paper. We probably not as much as we used to, but I think we still use paper. tire manufacturing facilities shut down. I think we still use tires even on hybrid cars. So we do still use these things, but yet somehow we don't want to manufacture them. I go back to the point I made earlier in the show when Ron Paul pointed out that just forcing Apple to bring its iPad manufacturing back to the United States doesn't address the bigger problem. You're automatically going to make iPads more expensive. Therefore, the access to that technology that could be a game changer for somebody in a small business then you've actually exacerbated the problem. So when you hear people and they talk about, well, we want to be bipartisan. What does that mean? Is it just a way to get the government to get together and divvy up the pie that you have to give them, or you go to federal prison? You certainly don't want that. You're not going to go to prison, but you have to give them the money to be the venture capital. And so, when you hear the No Labels campaign and you say, well, we're going to be bipartisan solution makers, I don't disagree with people who say, I'm concerned about this. I'm not necessarily thrilled about this idea that they're the answers. We got Dale on the line while we're looking for Pat McCrory here. And Dale, thank you for checking into the Lars Larson Show. You can join in as well at 866-HEY-LARS. What's on your mind, sir?
Well, you brought up The View and the bipartisan non-label thing. Obviously, The View doesn't really know. You there?
Yep.
Oh. Obviously, The View doesn't really pay attention to what's going on because there is no bipartisan. Biden just tried to go back through and give all the guys who went out and got college educations that don't mean anything a total payoff. Unfortunately, I'm 48 years old, and I wanted to go to college when I was younger, but I knew I couldn't afford it, and my parents couldn't afford it, so I joined the Army. And I went through the Army for 4 years to try and get an education and to get some kind of skills. And I'm currently a welder fabricator, and I make $40 an hour. And if I had known that the government was going to do a big payoff when I got older against college, I for sure would have gone to college. I think it's really unfortunate that we've got this bipartisan talk going on. And we don't need bipartisan. We need someone to step up and do something. Even Lars has brought it up that the Republicans that have made all these promises last year, if they got reelected, would do something. They're not doing anything at all. So I don't understand why we're talking bipartisan here, especially with the View throwing a pitch about Donald Trump becoming president again. Personally, I voted for Donald Trump the first time.
Dale, we've got to run. Dale, I'm going to ask Pat McCrory that if we find him. 1-866-HEY-LARS is the phone number we have found. Governor Pat McCrory from the No Labels organization, but Matt jumped in on the line, and when I get a moment, I'm going to explain why that last segment I sounded so halting as we were trying to go through the segment. It has to do with typing and the one class I failed in high school. But Matt, you're on the Lars Larson Show. What's on your mind? Are you calling in about the No Labels movement?
Well, actually, I'm calling in about our China and our Japanese foreign situation here. We need to bring it back to America.
We do, but do you agree that Ron Paul had a point, though? Ron Paul had a point when he said just bringing something back to America and making it prohibitively more expensive because of our labor laws, it doesn't help an American either. And that's where I think we try to we dance around it. We think it's a 1 or a 0 answer. Sure, I would like Americans making everything. I watched Bethlehem Steel start to reopen about 5 or 6 years ago. I never thought I'd see that happen. But we also have to make sure that American manufacturing is cost effective so that Americans can afford the things they're making.
Well, the problem is that we've got $16 to $20 hamburger flippers out there. Sure. Our hamburgers cost us, $10 now. That used to cost us $1.25. We've got gas up here. I don't know if you're from Washington State or not. We have the highest gas prices in America, which is let me see, we're at $5 a gallon now. And what we need to do is get our leaders, supposed leaders. They're not our leaders. They are supposed to be serving the people, and get them under rein and bring it back to sanity.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you.
Let's see what our governor here in Washington is insane. This guy is taxing us out of the world, and that's why no company wants to build anything in the United States, because the taxes are just insane. It's crazy.
Well, let's see what Pat McCrory says about this, because this is substantially one of the issues that faces all of the political parties. Is what is the government's role in this? Is it Munchausen's by government, where they've made us sick and they're insisting that they're the only ones who can make us better? Governor McCrory, I'm glad we were able to catch up with you. Thank you, sir. How was the town hall that just wrapped up?
It was packed. We are over capacity and had to have about 3 different waiting rooms for all the people that showed up here in New Hampshire. And your former governor spoke, along with John Huntsman and along with myself, Joe Lieberman, and Dr. Ben Chavis. So we had a wonderful dialogue, a lot of questions and answers, and we unveiled our 30 issues of common sense issues and solutions regarding no labels and what the American people are saying. And we talked about the next steps also.
Well, and certainly I understand, and I have no trouble with multiple candidates on a ballot. I really don't. I don't get invited to a lot of political parties. I don't get invited to a lot of parties at all, Kevin.
We're actually getting MoveOn.org and several organizations are trying to stop our efforts right now in North Carolina, Maine, and Arizona, because some groups don't want any competition for either the Republican or Democratic Party, in this case, the Democratic Party. And I'm a Republican who believes competition's good and it makes everyone stronger. And right now, 60 to 70% of the people are saying in surveys that they don't want Biden or Trump. And there's a gap here of somehow the parties aren't listening to the majority of the people who will be voting in the general election. So we'll see what happens after Super Tuesday.
Well, let me ask you this, though, because a lot of the listeners of this show and my local listeners in Charlottesville as well say that every time we hear, we're going to compromise, it's somebody, a conservative has to take 3 steps left and the progressive has to take 1 step right, whether it's the issue of life or speech or self-defense. How do you counter that, Governor McCrory?
Well, I'll give you an example on the issue of immigration. We're at a time as a Republican when we had the presidency, we had the House and the Senate, we didn't get a bill passed because we couldn't agree upon ourselves, which still concerns me to this day. But frankly, the no labels recommendation is going to be where the Democrats have to support a strong border. And right now they don't. They're afraid to irritate the base for fear of being called a name or whatever. Being anti-whatever. And the fact is we've got to have a secure, strong border to make sure we aren't smuggling people or drugs in across the border. And yet at the same time, we have to recognize we've had people in the United States who came over when they were 2 years old. Now they're in their 20s. And to be pragmatic, we're not going to send them back to their original country. We're not going to do it. So why don't we make them productive citizens? And if we'd also secure the border. And neither the Republicans or Democrats say that because they're afraid of irritating their their primary base, and therefore nothing's happening, and we have a disaster at the border for another decade.
What about something like nationwide e-verify?
I don't think that's two steps backwards. I think that's pragmatic common sense that the majority of people agree with.
But what about inside? What about things like nationwide e-verify? Say, let's just take that one issue.
Well, we didn't get that specific, but that should be on the books anyway. I mean, by the way, I was governor. I vetoed legislation by my Republican legislature to weaken E-Verify, and my Republican legislature overrode my veto. What they called conservative legislature overrode my veto, and I thought Ronald Reagan was right all along, and he was the one who brought out E-Verify.
So what other key issues? I mean, we and I said this at the onset, setting up this, that I feel like every conversation I have is a debate because people are relying on the government for so many things. Pat, how do we get broken from that addiction that the government's going to fix whatever ills we come into the polling place with?
Well, the government's not fixing our energy problem, that's for sure. So No Labels is saying it's foolish to cut off fossil fuels. First of all, it's unfair to the middle class on how much they'll be paying, and it's foolish regarding our national security. So we're saying very strong, we're not going to cut off natural gas or coal, and we're going to also put more emphasis on nuclear power, and we'll do renewables. But the fact of the matter is, right now, so many of the materials and supplies that we need for example, electric batteries, are in control of China. And also we've got to figure out a plan to dispose of all of these materials. As you know, in energy, every energy source has a negative also. And so we've got to be realistic. And we've also got to realize that big increase in any pollution is not coming from the United States, but it's coming from India and China.
Last one for you, Pat McCrory. Pat McCrory is on with us, former governor of North Carolina, part of the No Labels group. Matt's call is right on the money, though. I mean, we want to bring jobs back to the United States. Where is the middle ground between, overseas countries that manufacture things for pennies on the dollar and American labor policy? Where's No Labels on that?
No Labels is in the position of on issues that impact our national security. We do have to have a certain percentage of those made in the United States, not just for our economy, but for our national security. And right now, so many products in which our national security is dependent upon is made overseas, and we aren't dependent upon it. Much of it's made in China, and that's inexcusable. So the government is going to have to play an incentive role to bring those security measures back to the United States, while at the same time, by the way, it's foolish where we're shipping in certain energy sources from the countries that we're fighting against, or seeking more oil from Venezuela while we don't use the oil and natural gas in our own country. It's just a foolish
Governor
thing.
McCrory, we've got to run to the bottom of the hour here. Thank you. It's nolabels.org. Check them out. Take a look. They're going to be around. And this is the Lars Larson Show. Joe Thomas filling in for Lars this week, and thank you for letting us be of a little bit of a service to you as you wind down your Monday. And 866-HEY-LARS is the phone number. Emails can come into joe@wchv.com. Vote in our Twitter poll as well. It's brought to you by AMAC, the Association of I don't want to say it wrong here. Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC is better for you, better for America. 888-262-2006, or go online to amac.us. It's talking about sanctioning. Should the United States sanction China over all the fentanyl that is getting into the United States and killing more people than you can even wrap your head around? And there are issues, and there are issues like the fentanyl scourge or the child and human trafficking scourge. Look at the box office. My wife and I are enormous Jim Caviezel fans. I think we've seen every episode of Person of Interest 3 times. enormous, huge Jim Caviezel fans. That being said, though, look at how many people are turning out and voting with their limited cash money to see this movie. When it's not escapist. How many comic book superhero escapisms are out there on the big screen, and here's Jim Caviezel in The Sound of Freedom. How many times are we going to turn around and realize we agree on so many more things? A simple thing. Years ago, constitutional amendment in Virginia protecting more thoroughly people's personal property in the wake of the Kelo decision and, Suzette Kelo and Pink House's great documentary. They wrote a constitutional amendment that not only doubled down on the Fifth Amendment protections against takings, but also made the state liable for your court costs if you had to go to court to defend your private property ownership against the state. And that little constitutional amendment faced a concerted campaign by the Democratic Party of Virginia, and all of their associated little county and city Democratic parties were all on the campaign march against this constitutional amendment protecting you from the government, restricting the government. And yet, despite that headwind, 75% of the voters in Virginia voted in favor of this constitutional amendment. Why, my hometown of Charlottesville, Virginia, gets joked about constantly. Oh, it's left-wing Charlottesville, left-wing Charlotte. 65% of the voters in left-wing city Charlottesville voted in favor of one of the most core conservative principles. So when I hear folks talking about no labels and compromise, and they say, what are we compromising about? This is going to sound harsh. I have an expression I use on my local show. It's called victimless crimes, crimeless victims. It's a play on the expression victimless crime. But the podium jockeys of America will jump in exchange for some free news camera time, which, if you ask a political consultant, they will tell you is far more valuable than any 60-second breathless TV ad that they can run during the Super Bowl. Oh, you see, you're seen on a podium saying, I'm going to fix this person's problem, when there may not even be a problem at all, and often in an honest effort to do what they said they were going to do, they make it worse. So we, both conservative and liberal, Republican, Democrat, libertarian, the less we ask the government to do for us, whether it's revitalizing our downtown area. Well, who unvitalized it? It was just like Matt's phone call. Who drove the jobs away? The restaurant industry is still struggling. People don't want to work for $15 an hour. And then if they do get them for $15 an hour, they have to charge so much for the hamburger that people leave. People stop coming there because a hamburger was going to be an inexpensive lunch. Look at how many closed Burger Kings and McDonald's and Wendy's there are, because people are saying, you know what? It's approaching $10 for a Big Mac in some of the bigger cities. If I'm going to do that, I'll go buy ground beef at the grocery store. Sure, it's a lot more expensive thanks to the climate change zealots. But the reward that a lot of these podium jockeys are looking for is that momentary appearance on CNN or ABC or Fox News that is worth hundreds of paid TV commercials. That's what they want. They want that camera time. So you get some crimeless victims, and they run and they say, "Oh, I'll get on national TV and I'll get some free airtime, some earned media," is what the consultant class calls it. Meanwhile, the pain doesn't get any better. I want to go back to what Gary was talking about the border as well. McCrory brought it up a little bit. Citizenship is what they're not talking about. We're talking about the open border. What we're talking about is a dilution of citizenship. And 866, hey, Lars, you can call in and we can have a laugh over how little a 25-year-old born and raised in America kid knows about their civil rights and what the Bill of Rights actually entails and what are your responsibilities to go along with those rights. See, a lot of people come to the United States. A lot of people live in the United States thinking the United States is the land of milk and honey. And, this is just this bounty. You hear these podium jockeys, these elected officials talk about in a wealthy country, the United States. And I hate to be pedantic. My dear friend Holland always chides me about being pedantic about things like that. But we are not a wealthy nation. We are a free nation that has created a lot of wealth. But the nation doesn't control it, and that's generation after generation where we lose control of that narrative, where we kind of soften our stand on whether, maybe we should be a wealthy nation. And certainly the rest of the world, the money in those nations belong to those nations in most cases, not to you. There's a very interesting debate that I've had with some very, very, very engaged constitutionalists. As a matter of fact, one of them is one of the fellows who wrote that constitutional amendment in Virginia on property rights. He said, one of these days, we're going to get back pre-16th Amendment, where your income, where your earnings are considered property, and that under the Fifth Amendment, you can't just take my property without just compensation. You're listening to the Lars Larson Show. My name is Joe Thomas, 1-866, hey, Lars. It's Joe Thomas in for Lars from the second greatest city in the history of mankind based on the work product of some of our native sons, Charlottesville, Virginia. We got a cultural phenomenon hanging on the guest line for us. You can call in at 866-HEY-LARS. Email me at joe@wchv.com. Let me go to Matt, who's got a question for us, and then get Brent in here, too, before we go to Jason F. Wright, the author of The Christmas Jars and really a cultural phenomenon. Matt, you have the stage. What's on your mind, sir?
Yes, sir, Joe Thomas. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Sue.
I know Lars quite well. I've even been suspended one time for dropping my phone. But my point is this. The entire Biden administration needs to be thrown out of the White House, and we need Trump back. What's your opinion, sir?
We definitely need to get rid of the progressive agenda and the Green New Deal. Is Donald Trump still the Donald Trump of 2016? I will parry back to you. Is he still campaigning to the forgotten man? Does he need to get back to that campaign of the forgotten man?
Well, I know I got a beautiful flag from him, from Sebastian Gorka. What do you think about that?
I think that's great. I'm not talking about the trappings. When all of the Christmas baubles are gone down in Whoville, do we still come out and sing? And that's the thing is, the policies that President Trump put in were some of the best ever. But he got beaten up into losing the forgotten man, and still got more votes than ever. And I want to see if he can get back to that, because we need those policies. Absolutely, we need those policies. And I need to see that he's the guy that can do it. If not, we need to figure out who is. Let me get to Brent here. Good morning. See, that's old habits. Good evening, Brent. What's going on?
Hey, good. Hey, thanks for taking my call. I appreciate
it. Brent here. Good morning. See, that's old habits.
You got to turn your radio down there, Brent.
Hey, thank you for taking my call. Can you hear me?
All right, we got to move off of Brent because he's got the Lou Gehrig thing going on there. Joining us now, author of a true cultural phenomenon, The Christmas Jars, best-selling books, millions and millions, changing people's lives across the country, and now perhaps changing publishing itself. He is Jason F. Wright. Jason, how are you doing, my friend?
I am doing so well. How are you, Joe Thomas?
I'm busier than I've ever been, but I've also remember when I was unemployed, so I don't mind being busy. So, Jason, your story goes from somebody who, and this is so common, in publishing, it's a lot of factors lead into, why somebody gets a gig, why somebody gets a publishing deal. You're trying to change the way publishing is done in a way that I'm kind of surprised the internet hasn't done before. Tell us where you've been in the last 6-8 months, and what's brought you here.
Well, I appreciate that, Joe, and the setup, and congrats, by the way, and what a great gig. I'm so proud of you and a Charlottesville guy hosting this national radio show with who knows how many people tuned in right now. Joe, you're the man. And you know what? If it's not Trump in 2016, it might as well just be Joe Thomas. I would back Joe Thomas for president. Let's make a go at it. You can put me in your cabinet somewhere. Joe, I feel like, where have I been the last 6 to 8 months? It's really where have I been the last 20 years. I've been in traditional publishing. I've had some really good experiences with New York publishers, with the regional publishers. I've had some not so great experiences over the last 20 years. And I wrote this middle grade book, a values-driven, family-friendly, really rooted in traditional values book called Scar Dakota. It's for middle school kids and their families. And it's a novel, but there's a lot of myself drawn into the lead character, this young man named Scar Dakota. And I started talking to publishers about it, and I started getting some pushback. And this was early in 2023, so just here in the last several months. Like, the industry has changed. A character, a young man that looks like you, might be kind of a tough sell in publishing. Would you consider changing, gender or race or some other characteristic of your lead character to make it a little bit more trendy and current with what's selling in publishing? And I said, God, I can't, because that's not the lens that I wrote this story through. That's not the lens that I lived my middle school experience through. The lead character is a seventh grader, and I was not that other kind of seventh grader. With great respect to those of different beliefs and orientations and races and genders, I happen to be a kid from Charlottesville, Virginia, middle school, with a certain set of experiences. And so I wanted this lead character who experiences some really fascinating lessons on life and love and loss and racial and cultural diversity and learning to tell the truth and how hard that can be for a kid sometimes. I needed him to experience those things through his eyes. And so I said, look, I think I got to go my own way here. And so I'm rolling the dice. I'm experimenting with a Kickstarter campaign with crowdfunding for the first time to say this. I'm not beating the drum. I'm not trying to feed into the outrage machine of social and cultural divide that's going on in the country right now. And you and I have talked about this before, Joe. I don't want to tap into that. I just want to say, can't we do it differently? Can an author control his content a little more and say, I don't need publishing fingerprints all over the story. This is the story I want to tell to the world. So let's bypass the system and let's take it right to you. And by the way, get the book out 12 to 18 months faster.
Well, and I've read a galley copy of the book, and it is a story of all the things that we need to be telling stories about now. There is diversity. There are challenges of who you are and what's your role in the world, and all these things that middle schoolers really need to know. And really, to be fair, kind of what J.K. Rowling tapped into a lot with that. So how can people help you? I know time is short here on this, and I want people to find out more about Scar Dakota, because you kind of wrote it in the wiki. I mean, you had focus groups of just fans kind of going online and reading chapters, but how can they help you with this crowdfunding publishing?
Great question. And some of the people might be listening right now. So shout out to my beta readers that joined me, about 100 families with little kiddos that would join me on Zoom for about 3 or 4 months as I wrote. Every day I would read to them chapter after chapter and talk about it, so we knew that we'd have a really tight, just a really entertaining story, and that's what we got, thanks to them. You can go to scardakota.com. If you just Google Jason Wright author, you'll find me. If you Google Jason Wright Christmas jars, you'll find me. The most important thing anyone listening right now can do that wants to disrupt publishing and maybe do things a little bit differently through the independent author's eyes, mine, you can go to Facebook and RSVP for the virtual event beginning August 1st. You can go right now and say, yes, I'm going to attend this thing. It's not a real event. You don't have to be anywhere. But there's a video I posted today on the Facebook page, on the event page, that explains all the details about why we're doing it.
Jason F. Wright, cultural phenomenon on the Lars Larson Show. Thank you, buddy. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Joe Thomas filling in for Lars this week from the second greatest city in the history of mankind, but we're going to have to be happy with the silver because we're not going to supplant Galilee. But if you think about it, between Jefferson, Madison, and Jesus, who colored their work as well, more people live in freedom on this planet than ever did before, whether they want it or not. That becomes the question. Is it cyclical? Is it cyclical? 866 Hey Lars. Is it freedom is won through the blood of patriots, and then prosperity follows, and then apathy follows, and then tyranny follows, and then the blood of patriots needs to be spilled again? Or can we change it? Are we self-aware enough to change that tack? Coming from Charlottesville, this is a poignant thing, and I asked earlier, I'm sure your hometown has been in the national headlines at some point. Charlottesville's summer of discontent even got the president in trouble. Why Joe Biden's first word of his presidential campaign was Charlottesville. And there are massive holes in what you may even know about Charlottesville and what happened there on August 11th and 12th of 2017. I was there. But what things happened in your hometown that went on misreported? There was a wonderful phrase coined by a fellow named Rosh, the drive-by media. And it's perhaps not even out of malice, but they wheel into a town where there's some compelling story that their Perry White-like editor said, go get that for the front page. And they fly out, and they go get the story, and then they leave, and everyone's sort of sitting there saying, what just happened? It's a drive-by media-ing. 866 Hey Lars is the phone number. You can follow us Instagram and Facebook at The Lars Larson Show, Twitter at Lars Larson Show. And you can jump in on our Twitter poll, brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens, conservative values that I believe in. I joined, and you should join as well. I did. I've been in there for a decade, I think. So go to amac.us or call them at 888-262-2006. AMAC is better. Better for you, better for America. The president came up with another qualification for some amount of student loan debt that he wants to be able to say he forgave. At some point, only left-handed Aboriginal basketball players are going to qualify. He's going to keep coming up with new, well, what if I... And we're going to get into this with one of the plaintiffs in the Supreme Court case that really should have put the cover on all this and said, okay, nothing to see here, move along. And it keeps coming back. It's the zombie apocalypse. But I want to pick up on something that Matt was talking about in the last segment when he called at 866 Hey Lars. And I still don't know what Brent wanted to talk about. He couldn't turn the radio down. He was getting the weird feedback. But he talked about, President Biden. We need to get President Biden out and get Donald Trump back in. And we saw kind of what happened in the midterms, what happens when you personalize these things. You make it, well, this guy is going to fix everything for me. And I just came from one of the biggest libertarian conferences in the world. And, man, I got a lot of stink eye when I brought up the fact that policy for policy, Donald Trump was the closest thing I've ever seen to a libertarian president. Right to try and criminal justice reform and so many of the things he did. And so many things they hated him for doing. But is anyone else in the field going to go in there and try to reform all these bureaucracies that reign supreme? When the Queen died, Daniel Hannan, who I hold in very high esteem, I've met him a bunch of times, he's even been on my show a couple of times, he penned a piece, I think for National Review, in which he said, maybe what the United States needs is a constitutional monarchy. And I sent him an email. He never responded, probably, got to some assistant's desk and said, who the heck is Joe Thomas? And I said, Daniel, we already have a monarchy. Ever since the days of I have a pen and a phone, and perhaps even earlier than that, I would argue some of this really started to manifest under the Patriot Act and maybe even the Camelot era of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. The president, each successive president, has taken for themselves more and more authority that isn't constitutionally theirs at all. They legislate, look at West Virginia versus EPA and that Supreme Court ruling, said, this presidential executive branch bureaucracy cannot just go and legislate people's property rights away. You need a bunch of Congress people to actually put their names on it, and that's what they're afraid of doing. And that's when they assail law enforcement, when they get behind their podium and assail law enforcement. But they never take responsibility for writing the laws that the law enforcement officers were enforcing, were they? And if you think a law is unjust, get rid of it. Well, they don't do that. They want to be the ones who are calling out the bad actors who are just doing their jobs. They're just doing a job that becomes increasingly hard as populism grips all of the branches of it because everyone wants to be in charge of a bag of money. And I wish there was something cultural about it. I wish you could point to, no, they just want the patronage. They want the power of the purse. They want to have a budget that they can distribute to the people that they want to distribute it to. Look at the CHIPS Act. Tomorrow, our U.S. Senator here in Virginia is going to have this big event about the CHIPS Act. Why does the U.S. government have to encourage companies to make microchips? It'll be Tuesday at 9 a.m. Chips for Virginia Summit. Federal and state government officials with bags of their own taxpayer money, academic leaders, but look at us. Find a person that doesn't have some microcomputer in their hands, a pocket. Even the people with the flip phones, there's chips in there. Why do we have to? Think about that. Emails joe@wchv.com or 866-HEY-LARS. Student loans next, though, on the Lars. Joe Thomas sitting in for Lars tonight, and the president continues to qualify new and more varied ways where he tries to find some group that he can forgive their student loans. As I said, at some point, some left-handed Aboriginal gingers are going to be, well, I can do these guys, right? It'll be like $80. It's now more and more narrowed, but he keeps trying to be able to say he's just doing blanket student loan forgiveness. And joining us now from the Pacific Legal Foundation is Caleb Kruckenberg, who, along with Pacific Legal, had an amicus brief in the Supreme Court case regarding the HEROES Act. Caleb, thank you for taking some time out for us on the Lars Larson Show. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Well, it's amazing to me. It's just the president keeps coming back and saying, well, maybe I could do these people. At some point, there's going to be a couple of guys named Steve, and he'll say, can I just do these guys? Can I just give them? How many more times do you think the president is going to come out and try to claim that he's doing some student loan forgiveness?
Well, I think they're going to just keep at it. And I think the goal for them is maybe it'll stick someday. Mm-hmm. I kind of think of this as the first round in the Supreme Court was Plan A. And meanwhile, I think they thought that Plan A probably wasn't going to work out, or the Supreme Court wasn't going to agree with them. Mm-hmm. So they did Plan B, and they're working on Plan C. And, they're just going to keep at it, I think, until the courts stop them again. And, eventually I think maybe there'll be an end to it, but as long as he's the president, he's going to keep trying this game.
And again, we were talking about this earlier in the show. It's about looking like you've done something, whether you have or haven't, but there's real dollars that will follow down this rabbit hole that will continue to weaken the dollars that most of the people out there are earning, many of them with college degrees they paid for themselves and probably worked years and years and years to pay back.
That's right. And I think, originally when the president announced student loan cancellation, there was kind of this, I think, acknowledgement that Congress had considered it and didn't go for it because it's not really a fair or appropriate or responsible kind of a plan. If you just throw money at student loan debt, all that does is it rewards people who went to college and didn't pay their loans, and it encourages colleges to raise tuition. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, everybody else has to pay for it. If you didn't go to college, if you paid back your loans, it's sort of you're punishing people for making responsible choices. So Congress didn't go for it. So originally he's like, well, I'll do it anyway. What are you going to do? How are you going to stop me? That didn't work out. And once again, instead of saying, well, if this is important to people, let's ask Congress to intervene, sure. Instead he did a press conference the same day as the decision. And he said, you know what? I got lots of ways I can try to do this again, and I'm going to keep at it.
So let's put this into perspective. The premise is the HEROES Act, and I know the amicus brief that you filed with former members of the House of Representatives that had written the HEROES Act. That said this wasn't what this was for at all. Is this a dangerous genie's bottle that if he finally figures out a way to do this, that there's really no cap to what he could, or any future president could claim the HEROES Act gives him the opportunity to throw bags of money at people?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the Supreme Court's decision is pretty narrow and common sense. And basically all the court said was, look, you can't just magically discover this kind of massive authority to just remake the student loan system with, huge impacts to everybody in America just on this by squinting your eyes at a statute that is kind of vague, that seems to suggest the Secretary of Education has a lot of authority. That's not how we make these important decisions. Mm-hmm. And the president has now said, well, there's a different statute. There's what's called the Higher Education Act, and that lets me change the terms of repayment, and maybe I can forgive hundreds of billions of dollars of student loans that way. And I think it's the same kind of move. We're looking at a statute that is kind of vague, that suggests that the secretary has some authority to implement a plan And they're saying this gives us the chance to just change everything and, really make this massive change to the American economy.
And it's a bank breaker too, because this is the stuff that the nightmare scenario of all of the debt that is going to continue to eat away at our dollars that we earn, causing our bread to go up, causing our gas to go up. Meanwhile, as you mentioned earlier, untethering the university system from ever having to be concerned whether the incoming class of 2029 can actually afford what they're going to pay for per credit hour.
I mean, it's so unbelievably irresponsible to take a time of record inflation, generally, just across the board, and dump lots and lots of government spending on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that does nothing but cause more inflation. And then you're adding tuition inflation and a massive amount of debt. And all of this is where the president is saying, I alone can do this. This is all my authority. Congress has no say here.
But
and
is there a congressional fix to this, or is this something that's still going to have to be in the courts?
Well, I think it's probably going to continue to be litigated in the courts, but there could be a congressional fix. And I think Congress, I think student loan forgiveness and what the president is trying to do is so unpopular. I think people realize that. And I think Congress has an opportunity to come back and say, this is irresponsible, and we want to be very clear, shut this down from the front. I don't know if they're going to be able to do that. That's their decision to make. But if they don't, I think we're going to have to continue to litigate this, and there are going to be more challenges.
Is this perilous in the same way I think a lot of people in the 2022 midterm said, oh, we're just going to call it Bidenomics, we're going to call it the Biden economy, and like progressives do, they came in and said, well, we'll just send you more money, and we're kind of handing them that ground of, well, we know you can't pay your student loan debt because you're a barista now, and they're going to give you more money. And are they really playing a smart game of political chicken, saying, we know we can't do it, but we're just trying to win the next election?
Yeah, I mean, I think realistically, they weren't trying to hide it very much. President Biden came out in August and September, just before the midterms, announced his first policy, and they're just continuing to say, this is the Supreme Court out of control. They're stopping us from giving you money. And really, that's not what this is about. I mean, this is about who makes these kinds of decisions. This is really about how government is supposed to function. But, it's politics. And I sort of understand that. But I think we should all be concerned about a president who says, I can do whatever I want. How are you going to stop it?
Well, and I tell my friends on the left, well, what happens when it's a Republican or what he starts doing? But, Caleb, I appreciate everything you do at Pacific Legal. By the way, I like the new depiction of Justice, Lady Justice, that I saw at Freedom Fest last week. Big poster there. Boy, she looks like she's right out of a DC comic. I bet she would give Batman a run for his money.
I will pass the message along.
Well, thank you so much. PacificLegal.org. And we'll be right back. 866 Hey Lars on the Lars Larson Show. Joe Thomas here for Lars, and appreciate you spending some time this Monday with us. 866 Hey Lars is the phone number. Emails can come into me directly at joe@wchv.com. I appreciate the greetings from a lot of the regulars from Charlottesville who have been in here. I spent a little time, and I mentioned this earlier, and actually mentioned it talking with Caleb from Pacific Legal. We were at an event that annually gathers lots of free marketeers, a lot of capitalists, a lot of libertarians, and a few political candidates. Usually you'll find at least one or two members of the Paul family there at Freedom Fest. And this year, the keynote speech, as it was in 2015, was delivered by a presidential hopeful. 2015, Donald J. Trump spoke to Freedom Fest, and many people look at that as the unofficial beginning of his presidential campaign in 2016. This year, it was Robert F. Kennedy, who spent, I'd say, 25, 30 minutes talking about free market capitalism. And it was so off-putting to sit in a room with somebody I know is seeking the Democratic Party nomination for president, and he's talking about how the free market actually is the most environmentally sound way to attack the environment and environmental issues, and how the free market is the best way to address poverty and that the cronyism, the consumerism, is a word I use for it. Here's $500, be a patriot and go shopping. It was refreshing to see, but do you buy it? And you know, the only people that have had such a visceral reaction from the media that supports guys like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, AOC and that crowd, John Kerry and his Learjet flying off again for more meetings on how dirty the climate is and how it's our fault. The most visceral reaction prior to this no labels group, because I actually truly think they are more scared of Joe Manchin than they are of Robert F. Kennedy and the Democratic Party. But do you buy Robert F. Kennedy? And should President Biden debate him? It's always been, for as long as I can remember, been the standard where if you got to 10% of the polls, you were included on a debate stage. Yet time and time again, when pressed on the issue, Karine Jean-Pierre says he is the sitting president. He doesn't need to be debating anyone. Really? Really? Imagine the sitting president should be debating people all the time. Isn't that how you convince somebody to vote for a bill for you? That's always what I thought. And so it's a fascinating. I'm curious to see what do you buy Robert F. Kennedy and his campaign? Because he's anywhere between 12 and 18% of the Democrats who are interviewed. And there are Republicans that, I don't know. Meanwhile, the press is just having a spasm over the size of various Republicans' contributions. Who's been doing the most fundraising? And they, Ron DeSantis had to lay off 10 staffers. And our governor here in Virginia, his political action committee has raised $5.5 million. But what he's been doing with this is he's been working in our General Assembly. See, this year, New Jersey and Virginia were off years, were outliers. This year, the entire General Assembly of the Commonwealth of Virginia is up for election. So the governor isn't, and maybe he keeps some of this money to use for a presidential run. There is scuttlebutt that part of the reason Ron DeSantis has laid off staffers is some of his big fundraisers have decided to go elsewhere. But you see, this is the stuff that happens when there isn't stuff to report. Was talking with Mackenzie, and she brought up a story out of Texas. We were talking about, what is the role of government, especially as we went into the segment on the student loan debt. Texas judge doesn't want to perform gay marriage ceremonies, screams the headlines from the Texas Tribune. And this is an interesting story. So she told me about this McLennan County Justice of the Peace, Diane Hensley. Justice of the Peace, one of their jobs is performing marriages. But she doesn't want to perform same-sex marriages. So she has filed a lawsuit against the state. Does this go beyond the commercial where, I think we can make a really legitimate argument that a business should be able to determine a borderline and what compelled speech, especially in a day where your reputation is so much more of your inventory than it ever was before. But you're a justice of the peace, but the hardest part in the medial landscape is finding a reasonably fair depiction of this story. Every single quarter inch of newsprint or electronic newsprint that is dedicated to this is taking a very direct lean to the left on the issue of gay marriage. And I have some weird feelings on and opinions on gay marriage. I think the whole "we want the right to get married" thing was offensive, not because the idea of same-sex couples is offensive, but the idea that the government gives you rights offends me as a conservative. And it offends me that the organizers of the movement felt so moved to use that turn of a phrase for really what were legal protections under what could be much less salaciously called contract law. But you can't get a march going over contract law, can you? Nobody is going to spend days stuffing envelopes over contract law. It says here that the party of the first part shall be included into the death benefits of. That's what they were looking for. They weren't looking for the right to get married, but they chose that because that was the campaign. That was what was going to get people's attention. That was going to get people fired up. Somebody's rights are being denied? Nobody's rights were being denied. What a lie. Anyway, we'll wrap up. 866, hey, Lars. Emails Joe at WCHV.com. Joe Thomas sitting in for Lars Larson. Glad he cleared that up there for us. Joe Thomas in for Lars tonight. And I want to finish up a couple of things. And I promised you I would tell you this. Earlier on, there was a segment we were a little halting. It was because I was typing at the same time I was trying to talk. And I grew up in the 70s. I went to New York City public schools when they were bankrupt. And I did okay. But there was only one class I ever failed, and this is ripped right from the pages of Rod Serling's Twilight Zone. Because in 1978, I really had no interest in learning how to type. And since then, I've done some things that have kind of shown me why I wasn't a great typer, but I could keep up to the speed. I just didn't do it in the style, and so I failed. It's the only class I ever failed in high school. But my attitude was, what do I need to learn typing for? I'm never going to type. And I said 1, 2, 3. Just in this studio alone, there are 4 typewriters staring at me like I'm Burgess Meredith from the old Twilight Zone, and I'm surrounded by my worst nightmares there. But that was kind of what was causing the halting speech, because I was trying to use parts of my brain that really only had one track in and one track out. We were talking about the issue with the paying back the student loan debt, and how the president is continuing to try to find new and perhaps permissible qualifications so that he could do it finally, so he could run his re-election campaign on hubba, 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 I gave you money. And I noticed that over the last 3 to 6 months, we have stopped to being so hyped up about the economics of the world. Maybe we're punching ourselves out over it. Maybe the results of the 2022 midterms have people, I think, rightfully concerned with just trying to say that the economy is on somebody's back and vote them out and we'll make a better economy. I think you need better answers, and they didn't hear them. And so, as that was going on, we also mentioned at 866, hey, Lars, I don't know if you've seen The Sound of Freedom yet, but still top box office, despite all. In a lot of movie theaters, you're only getting it one time a night. You're getting 18 theater, 21 theater movie complexes, and they're showing the movie one time a night, which is better than many of these conservatively themed movies are. But it's still, now it's nipping at Tom Cruise's heel. Tom Cruise's new movie jumped in at number 1 in the box office, but there's Jim Caviezel still going on at number 2, another week. And this is what needs to happen. I don't remember, it was 6 or 7 years ago. People say conservatives had abandoned Hollywood. Conservatives had abandoned the entertainment medium. And they were relying on talk shows to carry the water for them. And we try to be entertaining. Like I said, Lars just does such yeoman's work, and I do what I can. In Charlottesville, we try to be entertaining about it. But you look at the gut punch of a story like this, or I'm forgetting the movie that Dean Cain did about Theodore Gosnell, the butcher of Philadelphia, the abortionist that was just. And Dean Cain, Superman. We have Hercules and Superman on our side. We should be able to do these films. We should be able to tell better stories. It's like Jason Wright's book, the Christmas Jars, and this new one, Scar Dakota. When the publishing houses say, "Yeah, can you make it a transgender? Can you make it more ambiguous what the main character's gender really is?" And as he said, in the time he had, it completely weakens the story, because the reason the things he was learning were powerful was because he was kind of middle class white guy. Middle schooler, white kid. And so the things he was learning about diversity and different people's cultures and things were really kind of kicking the chairs out from under him. And it's a terrific book, and I see what he means when he says the characters got to stay the same. So we need to reclaim the entertainment industry, because just doing news and analysis, oh my gosh. I do it for a living, as does Lars. And I want a tearjerker. Jason F. Wright wrote see what happens when you get close to bedtime. Wrote a wonderful book called Recovering Charles, about a man who is estranged from his father, and then finds out his father, who he hadn't heard from in decades, was dead in New Orleans in Katrina, and he needed to go down and claim the body. It's a it's a tough book. I bawled all the way through it. I was sitting next to some guy who was listening to thrash metal in his headphones on a bus, and I'm just bawling like a baby. But that's what we need. We need, as the people who believe in the Constitution and the greatness of America, we need to start telling those stories. We need movies and records. We need, the people who are going to entertain the world. We need Bob Hope back. When Sebastian Maniscalco goes out there and is as hardcore conservative without slapping you with politics the way Lewis Black does, he's winning with us. And I'm sure it's not Heritage Foundation, it's not the Cato Institute, it's not the Hoover Foundation that Lars always broadcasts from out there in Stanford. But that's where the points are scored. That's 3 yards in a cloud of dust. When Jim Caviezel is the number one or number two at the box office week after week after week, people are going in there and bawling their eyes out and feeling so inspired at the end of it. When Sebastian Maniscalco has us in tears over wokeness, that's what we need. We'll be back Wednesday. Governor Glenn Youngkin, the great Chris Horner, and Seton Motley as well. Until then, so long, and thanks for all the fish.